Okay, you know, throughout the history of NA, and I'm sure that many of the old timers here, including me, can focus on this. By the way, I should introduce myself, which I haven't done yet. I'm an addict. I live in Chicago. I got clean in DC in April of 1987. I've been in Chicago since 2003. And since I was a newcomer, you know, there was a reticence in NA for common needs meetings. While in the big cities and places like Washington, where I got clean, there were meetings for us, you know, tailored, targeted to us, and in other large populations. Much of the fellowship was really ambivalent or even worse. The biggest concern was NA unity as called for in the second half of the first tradition. Next slide, please. You know, but what was always ignored in all these discussions is that the first tradition has a first half. And that first half talks about our common welfare needs. And the assumption has always been that everyone's common welfare needs are the same. But we in the LGBTQ plus community know that that's not necessarily the case. And society has gained greater acceptance of LGBTQ plus people, and NA has as well. Next slide, and I'll turn it over to Lib, who I will unmute here, who will talk about a little about one of our really important developments, you know, how of a big thing that got changed here in NA pretty early. Go ahead, Lib.
Morena koutou, my name's Lib, I'm an addict and I'm from Christchurch, New Zealand. Welcome, nau mai haere mai. So, I guess for all of us, it's about finding our spot in Narcotics Anonymous. And for me as an addict seeking recovery back in those early days in the 80s, being able to see a reading that was in part of the literature that was important for me when I got clean, which was the Little White Book. Initially, it said, as it notes, regardless of age, race, colour, creed, religion or lack of religion. So that literature was looking to try to make it inclusive for all of us. But in 1984, the Board of Trustees were tasked with revising. We revise our literature at times. So this group was tasked with revising the White Book to make it more consistent with our basic text. The 6th edition basic text is the currently approved edition. So it's one of the trustees, John F., saw a need for change. And I'm assuming we'll go to the next slide.
Next slide, please, and then show the video.
Do you want me to do the video and then?
Do the video first. Shane will do the video. Yeah. So what we have here is a video based on an interview that was done with John F. talking about the process that got that change. Go ahead.
Who we didn't discriminate against, who were welcome despite. We decided to add sexual identity. Okay, there was a trustee who was adamantly opposed to adding anything regarding sexual identification. She kept on banging her little fist on the table saying, this has nothing to do with addiction. And I would say in frustration, but this is what it's about. These are the things that don't have any, but it has nothing to do with addiction. And she was part of, you know, the trustees had little factions and blocks, and you know, she was a part of a little voting block that she could count on 3 votes against this if she kept on pushing. And who knows? The initial idea was to use the word sexuality.
Let me just interject here for a minute. We're talking about the section of the Little White Book where it says, regardless of age, race.
Yes, yes.
And it used to say, regardless of age, race, color, creed, religion, or lack of religion.
Yes.
So the first conversation was color and race was probably a redundancy, so one of those could be removed. And in place, you were arguing that sexual identity or sexuality
You're right.
Should be.
I was arguing for sexuality, and she never actually conceded, but I wore her down. And so she proposed sexual preference.
I remember that.
Which I was horrified by. And she never would have gotten what the objection to sexual preference was, ever. And this was 1985. And so, this was a new thing to move away from sexual preference because it was not a preference. It's not a choice. And by this point, the trustees are getting impatient. And I'm concerned that they're going to go with sexual preference. And out of the blue, and this was a stroke of inspiration, I said, what about sexual identity? And lo and behold, everyone said, oh, that's great. And that was the end of the discussion. Now, I, at the time, had no idea of the implications of what I had suggested and what we had just done. And that is that the term sexual identity is larger than homosexuality, larger than lesbianism. It includes a lot of other people. As we know more, the sexual spectrum seems to get bigger all the time, and we understand all these hidden identities that people have. So we, NA, were quite at the forefront of that. And so we have a phrase that there's no need to look at and change now. It covers a whole lot of people. And I never quite got the implications of that until Ron, you said to me a few years ago, "Oh, this is the most important thing you ever did." And so be it.
Yeah, and let me remember just slightly differently. I mean, and that's to be expected. We all remember those things just slightly differently when we're talking about events that happened 30 years ago. But I remember that after there was a basic concession to include this sexuality piece, then the debate began, what is the best way to do it, is to say, and sexual orientation was another one. And
right, orientation was on the table too.
Yeah.
Yes.
And basically at the time, this was all new to me. I'm thinking sexual orientation is right. That makes sense. And you began to argue for sexual identity on the basis at the time that it was more inclusive than whether one is gay or straight, it was almost like you were saying this with a sense of discovery yourself. But I'm sitting in the room. I'm a mouse in the corner because I'm office staff. I'm not part of the discussion. I'm just taking notes and stuff. But I was really fascinated by that. And I think you were more visionary in that moment than you're giving yourself credit for and remembering, because you made the point that it's going to apply to to others for whom sexual identity is an issue, and it's not just sexual orientation. If it was just about being gay, maybe that word would have been acceptable. I don't know.
Right. It's funny. All I can remember is that beyond sexual orientation or sexuality, those two terms, that were both on the table, and I think you're right, it's probably we were veering more towards sexual orientation. Sexual identity was not a term that I'd given any thought to. That was not, it just came to me at that moment.
So I'm not sure about how that was for you guys, but I remember the first time that I heard that interview with John F. Done by Ron H. It was just extraordinary. I was clean at that time, but to hear one of our predecessors, my cat, sorry, is jumping on the table. One of my predecessors had such an impact for so many of us. And for me, it really did mean that I was included, and the power of being able to read that piece of literature. So the passage became, regardless of age, race, sexual identity, creed, religion, or lack of religion. The White Book Basic Text revisions received near unanimous approval at the World Service Conference of 1986. This first appeared in the 3rd edition revised basic text in 1986. So the language has been around for a long time, we've been around for longer, and thank goodness we keep coming back.
Thanks, Lib. Next slide, please.
Thank you.
Okay, so fast forward a few years, the sponsorship work group was working from 2002 to 4. And one of the big challenge that we in the LGBTQ plus community have always faced is the traditional view of sponsorship that men should only sponsor men and women should only sponsor women. And the work group recognized that this does not work for everyone. Moreover, it was an experience-based book, and there were plenty of examples of successful cross-gendered sponsorship relationships. So in revising the IP and creating the sponsorship book, the suggestion was loosened. Next slide, please. So what the IP now says is a good rule of thumb is to look for someone with similar experiences who can relate to our struggles and accomplishments. For most, finding a sponsor of the same sex makes this empathy easier and helps us feel safe in the relationship. Some feel gender need not be a deciding factor. We are free to choose our own sponsor. It is, however, strongly suggested that we avoid getting into a sponsorship relationship that may lead to sexual attraction. And so, you know, in our literature now, of course, you know, that's the sponsorship IP revised, IP number 11, you know, revised. There are other places in NA literature that do talk about men with men, women and women, but at least our you know, fellowship approved message is this one here in the IP. Next slide, please. The sponsorship book had several quotes in it from members of the LGBTQ community, and you know, one of them was from a transgendered person. I am a transgendered person, and I have successfully sponsored men in my woman's role. During my transition, a man sponsored me. However, once my transition was well underway, I had to change to having a woman sponsor. Now, the only man I sponsor is gay. So here we have NA literature with these words in it. The next one, next slide, please. I'd like to call on Edna, if she could, if they could read this one, please. Let me unmute. No, this is hard. Hang on. Close that. Edna. Okay.
I got
Edna,
it.
go ahead.
I got it, Louis. Thank you. I'm an addict. My name's Edna, Boston, Massachusetts. Let me just move this a little. As a bisexual woman, I have the possibility of a romantic relationship with people of both genders. I pray for guidance and ask to have even the slightest sexual attraction to be revealed. This way, I could be the most help to both of us by saying yes to those I truly see as a sister or brother in recovery, and no to anyone I see as a potential date. To that end, I sponsor mostly straight women and gay men. I love myself and my fellow addicts enough to honor the intention of the sponsor-sponsee relationship.
Thanks, Edna. Next slide, please. And that was from the sponsorship book, page 79 to 80. Okay, this next quote, as a gay man, I have had a few different types of sponsors. I have been sponsored by another gay man, a gay woman, a straight man, and a bisexual woman. I believe the gender of my sponsor is only important in the following sense: that one should never be sponsored by someone where any level of sexual or romantic tension exists. And that's in the sponsorship book, page 44. So when this book came out in 2004, we had NA literature, you know, we were no longer closeted in any way in NA literature. We were right out there. Next slide, please. So then another big challenge that came our way was the World Convention of NA. The original convention, I don't know if the original, but the conventional guidelines for a long time did not allow common needs meetings, such as men's rap, women's rap, youth, LGBTQ workshops. The program listed regardless of ... sexuality, which wink, wink, nod, nod, everyone understood to be gay themed. We used to have illicit corridor meetings in the World Convention, for those of you who remember that. And then suddenly at San Diego in 2003, we addressed our concerns to the World Board and the ball started to roll. Next slide, please. So at the World Service Conference of 2006, made some really huge decisions, and it was after a great deal of discussion. The convention guidelines were just completely eliminated, and the conference then mandated that the convention in San Antonio have common needs meetings in it. And so what I've got for you are some photos of a program from the convention that I actually got from a friend of mine who died recently. But next slide, please. So in San Antonio, there were 3 LGBTQ plus workshops were programmed. We had a dance. I mean, I don't know if anybody remember that convention. That was one of the most fun NA dances I've ever been to. Next slide, please. And so because this was a new practice, the program had a discussion of the common needs meetings. This is what we're doing now. They hadn't done it in 20 years, something like that. And then the next picture, I'm not going to read through all that. The next picture actually shows the various workshops. There were, Spanish workshops, thankfully, in San Antonio. Should be gay and lesbian meetings. We called them gay and lesbian at the time. 3 of them. We had the dance. There were young people's meetings. There was also a young people's dance, by the way, where they did restrict entry from older people, if I remember correctly. There's men's meetings, women's meetings. This was the first time they'd done that, and it was in San Antonio. Next slide, please. I was going through that program and I looked at this one workshop here that they had, gay and lesbian meeting, playgrounds, playmates, and playthings. One of the speakers was Jenny W. and the other one was this guy named Louis H. from Illinois. I wonder who that is. So yes, I did speak at that convention. Next slide, please. So then a few years later, we had the 6th edition basic text, and there were several stories by LGBTQ community members were considered. 3 stories made it in. Sandwich on page 203, Finally Connected on page 235, Terminally Unique on page 264, representing a widespread diversity of our community. The reflections section has a beautiful passage dealing with coming out in an NA share on page 232. Next slide, please. I'd like to call on Scott to read these next 2 pages.
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm an addict from Kansas City, Missouri. The first time I shared in a meeting about being gay was very hard. I had 5 years clean and regularly attended the same meeting. I never spoke about being gay. I referred to my boyfriends as she or her. Whenever I talked about my relationships, I was asked to share my story at a large meeting and knew my newfound honesty demanded I share the truth about me.
Next slide, please.
The night I was scheduled to speak, my sponsor unexpectedly brought his wife, who was not a member, to the open meeting. She had invited me to her home many times for dinner and is a devout Christian woman. I didn't want her to know that I was gay. I was afraid she would reject me. I prayed to keep my commitments to share openly that night. Despite my fear, I told my story honestly for the first time. When I finished, she looked directly at me and gave me a big, beautiful smile that said everything was fine. People came up to hug me, and no one teased or ridiculed me for being gay. From that time on, I knew I could recover as a gay man in Narcotics Anonymous.
Thanks, Scott. Next slide, please. It's a beautiful section. Then in Living Clean, you know, the work group on Living Clean really wanted the desire to find language to reach the broadest group of people. Sexuality was discussed in very general terms in 2 places. Chapter 4, physical sex, and then Chapter 5, relationships, romantic relationships. Pages are there. Next slide, please. I think that may be. So what's next? You know, we have come a long way. There's a lot more to do.